So it's chapter 2, Mishnah 1. And so Rebbe had said, what's the best way you should choose that is beautiful to the doer, and also that is beautiful to the one who does it, but is seen beautiful by people. We talked about this at length. So we want to go to the second piece of the Mishnah, the second tranche of the Mishnah, where Rebbe, who is of course the author of the Mishnah, says, Ravi Zohar commit b'mitzvah kala kavachamura. So the second tranche of the first Mishnah in chapter 2, be as careful with a light mitzvah as with a heavy one. She'einat yodea matan scharin shel mitzvah. You don't know the reward of the mitzvah. Now this statement is somewhat problematic, because if you don't know the reward, so it's not that you just don't know which one is light and heavy. In other words, you don't know the reward of mitzvot, so therefore you don't know which mitzvah is lighter, which mitzvah is heavier. So don't say be careful of a lighter as mitzvah as a heavy. So there are several possibilities over here. The explanation. There are many different explanations. Some say there's an easy mitzvah to do or a hard mitzvah to do. In other words, a very easy mitzvah to do, or a negative commandment, a sin that seems light might not be. The classic examples are, embarrassing someone and so on and so forth. It might not be such a small deal. It might be a very big deal. But the Lubavitcher Rebbe has a very interesting approach, because he says after all these answers, we're left with the problem that what you're saying is that the light mitzvah is really a heavy mitzvah, or that the heavy mitzvah is perhaps a light mitzvah. So he says actually there are two different aspects of the reward in the mitzvah. The first is indeed commensurate with the reward and punishment. In other words, like with a negative commandment, if we tell you something carries the death penalty, or karet, or the soul being cut off, we know that it's a big deal. We know that it's something that impacts the world in a very negative way. Because there's two aspects to a mitzvah. One is the fact that you connected to God, and that's absolute. In other words, you connect to Hashem either by doing what's right or not doing what's wrong when you have the opportunity to do what's wrong. God is absolute. That connection is absolute. In other words, if you believe in Hashem, if you connect to Hashem, you do what God wants, that's absolute. Either you're doing what God wants, you're not doing what God wants. It's binary. Either you accept that God is the source of the universe and the source of your purpose. You accept that God has authority. You don't. It's absolutely binary. All mitzvot and all averot are equal in that regard. But in terms of their impact on the world, either on society, such as murder, or on the universe in a more spiritual sense, but on the purpose of creation, such as the laws related to marriage or the laws related to Shabbat, where the entire sort of structure of creation is enhanced by its observance and damaged by its non-observance. In other words, what damage do you do to creation? How much do you make the world a worse place? What damage do you do to the world? So clearly, whether it's mitzvot that are between man and man or man and God, some mitzvot do more damage than others. It's not coincidentally that the first thing we focus when someone converts to Judaism is on Shabbat and Kashrut and so on, because those mitzvot are very big in the sense that if we eat kosher, we transform our bodies, and if we don't eat kosher, our entire bodies are much less likely to be synchronized with the mitzvot. Our bodies are not in sync with our soul. Our bodies aren't capable of properly hearing our soul. And the same token with Shabbat. Without Shabbat, there's really no sense of God in a person's lives, or frankly, in the universe as a whole. And obviously, idol worship, is a denial of God's presence and of the entire basis for Torah. A person marries a non-Jewish woman, and that's it. That line is extinct. There's no more Jewish children. It's a terrible disaster. So those are all clearly the effect spiritually is very great. So there is a difference. The heavy mitzvot are the ones that have a profound effect spiritually. The light mitzvot are the ones that have a more subtle effect. So that's as far as the effect of the mitzvot. So Rebbe is saying, don't judge the mitzvot merely by their spiritual effect. Their spiritual effect also drives the reward or punishment as we know it. In particular, the punishment. Things that are very spiritually destructive tend to be very destructive to the individual who does them in a perfect universe. So that's the first level, yeah.
So if we're saying that those are absolute and there's right, which is, let's say, following as we said, and there's not. I mean, you mentioned this actually last time, but how does that relate to the first part of this parak, where it says like, what should one do? Whatever.
Well, I mean, their point there is that the way one needs to engage. On one hand, the person needs to engage in the mitzvot with the greatest possible commitment and intensity. That's the beauty to the individual. But on the other hand, you need to do it in a way that doesn't turn other people off. In other words, your intensity can't be expressed in such a way that it makes other people uncomfortable.
Okay.
But now Rebbe says that's how you do a mitzvah. Now we get to the mitzvah itself. So a person might think that the focus should be on those mitzvot that have very serious penalties or very great rewards described for them because of the effect, positive or negative, on society. So Rebbe says that's only one thing. You don't know the reward of the mitzvot. In other words, there is a reward of the mitzvot. The Lubavitch Rebbe argues that it's beyond all knowing. You don't know not because you don't know. It's hidden from you. It's in a box that you could open up one day and see. It's unknowable. Why? Because all the reward in this world or the next, or the punishment for the mitzvot, relate to the effect of the mitzvot on the world. But there's another aspect to the mitzvot again, which is this binary question of am I connected to God or not? And a connection to God affected by doing what's right and not doing what's wrong when the opportunity to do it is absolute and infinite. And that reward is not known because it's not in the realm of knowledge. Knowledge is about defining things, measuring things. So a person can have a reward in the next world that of a certain amount of knowledge and the pleasure that comes from it. But the greatest reward of the mitzvah is the union with Hashem, which is beyond any description, which is beyond any knowledge. So at that level where all mitzvot are equal, it's not in the realm of knowledge, therefore it's not in the realm of differentiation. So all mitzvot are equal. And therefore there's no reason not to be as careful with a small mitzvah, a mitzvah that seems to have a small effect in society, as a large mitzvah, because all mitzvot are equal, and you don't know their reward. The reward lies in a place that's not knowable, and at that level of beyond knowing, everything's equal, because the connection to God is its own reward. So Rebbe is reminding us that not to get merely caught up in our understanding, even our spiritual understanding of what the effect of the mitzvot are, but to understand that there's an absolute value. And by the way, and part of this is that part of this idea is that therefore it affects the way we judge others. Because if we understand there's an absolute value to every mitzvah, rather than worrying about what someone isn't doing, we seek to get them to do whatever mitzvah we can get them to do, because they have the benefit of this absolute connection. And then it goes on to say, this is very interesting, and this is actually Barchnur and the Rambam and Maimonides say this. This is the way they explain it. It's very beautiful. Measure the loss of a mitzvah against its reward, and the reward of a sin against its loss. Native say that. So the obvious question is that it's reversed. We say the loss of a mitzvah against its reward, and the reward of a sin against its loss, because by definition, the reason why there's a famous story that once someone was inspired, this yeshiva student was inspired by some philosophical tract he read to reject Judaism. So he decided that obviously obviously, since now that he doesn't have to keep the Torah anymore, he can enjoy himself. So one would assume, he figured in Talmudic fashion, that the biggest sin carries the greatest pleasure. So he knew that one of the greatest prohibitions in the Torah is chelev, eating fat, forbidden fat from a kosher animal, is actually stricter even than eating pork. It's a karet, the soul is cut off. So he took a candle, bit off a chunk, chewed it, and spit it out and said, "Feh, all the sinning business is no fun." So he went back to being a religious Jew. Now, the truth is that obviously there are things that are more pleasurable than candles, and that's exactly what the point that Rebbe is making. That if you notice that in the mitzvah, the pain comes first, and then the pleasure, and the avera the opposite. So measure the loss of a mitzvah. In other words, you imagine that your behavior is curtailed by Shabbat. You imagine that your profits are curtailed by honesty. You imagine that your social status is curtailed by not slandering others. You imagine that your gastronomic pleasure is negated by eating kosher. So that's the loss of the mitzvah. It's all the things we lose by doing what's right. So measure that temporary loss against the reward, which is permanent, whether it's the secondary type of reward that relates to the effect on the world, where it's the ultimate reward, it's a connection to God. It's a long-term infinite reward that is of benefit to one and one's family against the momentary pleasure that is of only benefit to yourself for a short period of time. Because by definition, once one attains the object of one's desire, so then there's no more benefit from it. Whereas with mitzvot, it's the other way around. On the other hand, measure the reward of the mitzvah. So the reward of the avera is immediate. The reason, again, barring the fellow with the candle, the reason that we sin is because there's an immediate gratification. But think of its loss, the negation of oneself, the negation of one's purpose, the ultimate suffering and guilt that comes from it, and most of all the fact that the sense that one has utterly wasted one's energy and has done the opposite of connect with God. You sort of move the world backwards. So the result of an avera until one repents, the punishment of an avera, the reward of an avera is the loss, and it's okay, it's fine. We'll keep it. It's not going to be screaming all day. The loss that is kemes of the loss that one incurs is permanent, just like the reward is permanent. So, but with the mitzvah, the reward comes later. With the avera, the reward comes first. It's called the u'ah principle. That with the avera, the ah comes first, and this is a very long u. With the mitzvah, the u comes first, this is a very long ah. But that's the premise. So Rebbe is saying that even in the context of looking at, first he says, don't worry so much about the rewards and the punishments. There's something much bigger at play. But conversely, understand that whatever reward there is in doing something wrong, it's temporary. And in the long term, even in this life, you have no benefit from it. And the reward for doing something good, even in this life, there's the benefit, even if it's simply the benefit of the knowledge that one's life is spent well rather than wasted. Because ultimately, the most basic human need is to be useful, is to be needed. A person who has a sense that they have nothing to accomplish, or that they have accomplished nothing, that's the most corrosive thing. And of course, and the connection between all these three statements is that Rebbe is saying, look deeper. In other words, it's not enough to do mitzvot, you have to do them in a way that encourages other people to do them rather than pushes them away. It's not enough simply to take the mitzvot at face value, you have to dig deeper. And it's not enough to take life at face value, what feels good right now, you have to look at the larger picture. And then he gives us a general set of rules that enable us to fulfill all three. Histalkel b'shlosha devarim. Look at three fundamental principles. You won't come to the hands of sin. In other words, you won't come to being in a situation where it's likely you'll do what's wrong. Know what is above of you. What is above you? Ayin roa, seeing eye, ozen shabas, and a hearing ear. V'chol masecha b'sefer nichtavim, and all your deeds are written in a book. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, when he was about to die, he told his students that I hope you fear God as much as you do human beings, because most people won't do a sin they're embarrassed of if someone's watching. So be aware at the very least that God is watching. So the point is, everything is filmed and everything is played back. So everything's written down. God hears and sees, and everything's recorded, and there's no limit to the space on the server. So anything you ever did, it's there. And you'll have to confront it and deal with it, both in your lifetime and afterwards. So the seeing eye is sort of the things you do. Obviously, ozen shemat is your thoughts, your inner thoughts, the hearing of your thoughts. And the idea is that until you erase them by tshuva, everything is written down. Now, there's one interesting thing here is that he begins by saying, look at these three things. And basically, a person, what is the reason why a person might engage in their religiosity in a way that is corrosive, that's abrasive to others? The first point, the first statement of Rebbe's. And the answer is because you forget that the mitzvot are gazud mitzvot. So know that what's above you. In other words, knowing what is above you isn't merely, these three things. The second thing is being careful in every mitzvah equally. So obviously the fact that you understand that it's God above you, and God is both unified and infinite. So you understand once again that all mitzvot are equal. As far as understanding that the benefit to sins is all front loaded, and there's a long back load to deal with, and the opposite is with doing good. So understand that everything you do is seen, and everything you think is heard, and everything is permanently set there. So you're going to have to deal with it. So there's a permanent dealing with your life, and again, if a person thought that the people nearest and dearest to them were observing what they were doing, there's the vast majority of things that they do wrong they wouldn't do, and certainly the things that we think we shouldn't think we wouldn't think. So this premise, this awareness, as if it were, that there's the one entity that's always with you is God, because God gives you your life. God is creating you at every moment. Therefore, God is aware of everything going on with you. This has a propensity. If one actually thought that A, God cares what I do, which is the basic premise of Torah, and B, God is aware of what I do, one would assume one's life would work differently. So this lays out the reasons why Rebbe's statements are made. But it's interesting. He begins by saying, the first thing is do the mitzvot for the right reason and the right way, and make sure that they bring people in and not the opposite. Then he goes on to discuss how and again, this all has to do sort of with a person's internal calculus, that when you approach life, how do you evaluate the risks in your life? How do you evaluate all these things? And that's the purpose of this Mishnah. Now, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi had a son, Rabban Gamliel. If you remember, we had a lot of Gamliels and Shimons, and we finally got a Yehuda. So Rabban Gamliel, this is basically the fourth Rabban Gamliel, and he is a figure not in the Mishnah, but in the Jerusalem Talmud, the Israeli Talmud. But he appears in Pirkei Avot because he was one of the older rabbis of the Talmud, like Rabbi Chia, who appears also here. So therefore his name appears. But he's pretty much the latest person that appears in the Mishnah. And he appears primarily because he already had reached a status as a teacher in his father's lifetime, because the Mishnah was arranged by Rebbe. So Rebbe, he was already sufficiently developed that he was already one of the rabbis, and therefore Rebbe put him into the Mishnah. Rabbi Gamliel benos Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, Rabbi Gamliel, the son of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, used to say, Yafet Talmud Torah derech eretz, that the study of Torah with derech eretz, with the way of the world, and I'm going to leave this untranslated for a moment because there are numerous translations. So Talmud, study of Torah is good with the way of the world, Shigia Shneya Meshkachat Avon, because the toil, the effort in both pushes away sin. V'chol Torah she'enim malacha, any Torah that does not involve work, Sofa B'Tela, the end is that the Torah study will be nullified, V'goreret Avon, and it draws sin in its wake. So this is the first statement in the Mishnah, so let's understand what he means. So we can begin. So the simple idea is that a person should have both a trade and study Torah. That, in other words, that a person's study of Torah should not be at the expense of a trade, even though it's a mitzvah to study Torah at every moment of one's life. That's besides all the things you need to do, like eating, sleeping, and so on and so forth. And one of those things is work. So, in other words, the idea is that a person should not be in a position where they study Torah and have to therefore be dependent on others to support them. Now, what's very interesting is that the Bartanura says that actually the Bartanura is very interesting because, first of all, he talks about malacha. There are several things that are very far away from contemporary Jewish life, and that is the idea of malacha, the idea of work, is literally work. In other words, a craft, working in the fields, and so on. The Bartanura says that studying Torah essentially weakens the mind's wandering. It focuses the mind so the mind does not wander to where it shouldn't. And working hard physically tires out the body, as we know that people of leisure are the ones who get up to the most trouble. Historically, if you look at history, until recent times, it's always the upper and intellectual classes whose behavior was the most corrupt and immoral. It's a common thing. Intellectuals always talk about middle class morality, because people who have lots of spare time, like university professors and aristocrats, get up to all kinds of questionable behavior. If the body's tired, you come home, you do what you need to, you go to sleep. You don't have all these times to get up into these kinds of grandiose Tolstoyan misbehaviors, because you have to work all day, right? So this is Bartanura, who, interesting enough, lived in Italy in the 17th century and was very aware of the bad behavior aristocracy. He takes it very literally. The Bavadri Bartanura says that studying Torah focuses your mind on positive things, so your mind isn't focused on negative things and negative ideas and negative fantasies. And you work a hard day, you're tired, you go home, and you don't have time to hang around the bars and get into trouble. That's the premise. But I should make a point that this idea of malacha, of work, is quite specific. There's this idea, Yagia kapecha kitochel. It says in Tehillim 128, Tehillim Kuf Chav Chet, if your hands toil, that you may eat, ashrecha v'tov lach, it's good for you. And in Hasidic texts, it explains that the hands should work. In other words, the mind should be free for the study of the Torah and contemplation of the great things. Whatever we do for work, it should be only the hands and the necessary intellect, to make those things happen. So from this perspective, actually, we would actually prefer agriculture or blacksmithing or plumbing and so on to the lawyers, and not necessarily the doctors, because the doctors are like the rabbis. By the 14th century, rabbis get salaries Because if you're busy teaching everyone, you don't have, you should really be a blacksmith. You don't have time to be a blacksmith, so we pay you for the time that you wouldn't be working. But ideally, the rabbis of the Talmud, who had a different kind of setup, they were studying for themselves, and there was a much, how do I put it? Knowledge was much more distributed, so you didn't have a need for rabbis like you have today. So the rabbis of the Talmud all were involved in agriculture and work, but literally work. In other words, work that exhausts the body. Which actually medicine qualifies for that. But my point is that your lawyers, your accountants, university professors, and so on, not necessarily. That's a function of sort of socially and where one can make one's living and so on. Remember, those categories didn't exist. But Bartanura says, or Rabbi Gamliel is saying, that exhaust the mind and exhaust the body, you'll be in better shape.
This is how in the Soviet Union, the Chabad existed in cobblers and tailors, but not as the university professors.
No, you had people of enormous intellectual ability, but that's not how they made their living. And just the opposite. The Lubavitcher Rebbe's were very sent a lot of people to the agricultural colonies in Kherson and the Crimea. They thought it was better to work for a living than to wheel and deal, because everyone's wheeling and dealing, and there wasn't anything produced. Now clearly we live in a different kind of economy today. But the way the Lubavitcher Rebbe explained it says, look, do what you want for a living, but don't get so absorbed in it that it becomes your passion. There's a story with the Rebbe Rashab, the fifth Lubavitcher Rebbe, that he had it by the late 19th century. There were a lot of Chabad Hasidim who had gone in, with the Industrial Revolution in Russia that came late and fast. They'd gotten involved in business and manufacturing and had done very well. And they're really the ones who supported a lot of the activities. But so there was one chassid who started a factory making rubber overshoes, galoshes. So he said that, so one day the Rebbe saw him, he was very preoccupied. He says, I've seen feet in kaloshin, in overshoes, but I've never seen a head in Yiddish overshoes, a kaloshin. He says, I've seen a feet in galoshes, I've never seen a head in galoshes. And the point being that one devotes the necessary intellect and energy, but it doesn't become your passion. It doesn't, whatever you have to devote, even if you are the lawyer or the professor. The real self is when you're, it's like you can learn from Dr. Aumann, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics. But everyone says the real person, who is he really, is when he gives a Daf Yomi shir in some little shul in Yerushalayim. That's the real Dr. Aumann. The rest is his business. It's his work. And that the point is not to use one's intellect. We're not saying you shouldn't use your intellect. We're saying, where's your passion? Where's your mind? Where's your focus? Where are you really? And this is. But the point is that the Bartanura argues that a person needs to have all their gears engaged. The mind should be engaged in Torah. The body should be engaged in work. In other words, idleness is the worst thing. To be lazy, to be idle, to be a leidigeir. Someone goes around doing nothing. That's the worst thing. That's why the Gemara says a person should better flay carcasses in the street, which is smelly, hard work, than say I'm an important person, feed me. So that's one idea. The second idea is that the Torah without work, because in the end the person becomes impoverished, right? And when you're impoverished, there's this great temptation to be dishonest. Like we were studying in the Sunday Talmud class, that when we find this dead body between two cities and we have to go out, and the elders of the city near to it have to go out and declare they didn't sin, what did they do? They didn't feed the guy, so the poor guy went out and robbed people, and someone defended themselves, But it's really the city father's fault that they didn't provide this person with food. Then he wouldn't have been tempted to go out and rob. So when a person doesn't have money, there's a temptation to be dishonest, right? There's a temptation, to be dishonest with what benefits one can get. In the modern world, in the old world, basically people who, when they reached a point, they didn't have anything, they went and they became robbers, So the point is that if a person sets out to devote themselves to Torah study, but doesn't also devote themselves to work, in the end they'll have neither, and just the opposite, not having developed a form of work, they'll be driven to desperation, and then they'll end up robbing people. So that's the that's the core idea. And he goes on to say, so because of that, now we get to the next point. Well, since the purpose of becoming a leader in the Jewish community is not for profit, in other words, again, even if you're paid what you need to survive, it's not a means of extracting money. It's not a means of because. So therefore, if you're involved with the community, be involved with them for the sake of heaven, not for profit and not for pride, because the merit of their forefathers helps them, and their goodness stands forever. In other words, that even if you look at the people you're dealing with, and you imagine that they, how are you ever going to move them? So there's 2 points. It's very interesting. On one hand, be involved with them for the sake of heaven. On the other hand, says Rabban Gamliel, wait a second. If I'm being involved with them solely for the sake of heaven and not for profit, why should I waste my time? Because as we all know, any leadership in the community is, any attempt to be involved in the community, people give you a hard time, people don't listen, no one ever does enough. If you ever take a leadership role, you end up doing all the work. We know all about all these things. It's the complaints of anyone who volunteers. So why should I bother? So the answer is that even if they seem not to be doing much, they have the merit of their forefathers, which means to say they're part of the Jewish people, and they have that momentum, that momentum from them, and you'd be surprised at what they can accomplish once they get going, and their righteousness lasts forever. The idea being is that, for example, even Jews with no connection to Judaism for 3 or 4 generations tend to be very charitable, tend to be very caring, because there's this momentum, there's this deeply ingrained, sense of responsibility and charity and so on and so forth. And the same thing, identity. Even people without a lot of knowledge tend to have more Jewish identity than their knowledge doesn't last forever. And the point is that don't get discouraged with who you're dealing with, because they're not just who they are. They're part of something that, is this long process, and they have that long process in them. So on one hand, be responsible and don't try to benefit from working with the community. On the other hand, you say, what do I need all this trouble for? There are a bunch of apathetic and uninvolved people. That's not so simple. You'll see that if you dig a little bit, that the sort of the core DNA, this momentum, this who they are, which is of all the generations who came before them, will enable them to step up to the plate and do what they need to do, if you only believe in them. And that's what I say, believe in them, even if they don't look impressive. Remember, they're part of something bigger, and they have the pressure of that larger behind them. And I consider it, I give you much reward as if you did it. What's the reward? You shouldn't take benefit. It shouldn't be for fun and profit. But if you encourage other people to do good, basically God considers it as of all those good. So you can do as much good as you can, but anytime you get other people to do good, it's considered as if you did all those good deeds. So the effort is worth it because there's leverage involved, because and more than that, the good deeds that other people inspire others to do good, it also benefits you. So it's like multi-level marketing. The difference is that with multi-level marketing, like all pyramid schemes, there's a finite. But when you're dealing with God, who has infinite resources, you don't have to worry about that. Good is not fungible. You can just keep creating more good, and it's not a problem. So we're saying that that's the idea that one person can be responsible for an incredible amount of good. If you just inspire a few people to do a little bit of good, that tends to snowball, because ultimately those who see them will also do good, etc.
You are all set.
That I don't know. There's much more to be done, but that's the idea. That the point is that Rabbi Gamliel is actually talking about something that's true throughout Jewish history, right? Moshe, the people give him nothing but tzaras. I mean, with the parsha we're reading now in the Torah, it's all about the trouble the people give Moses, right? And it's always been a thankless task. But the point is that from all this thankless task, the Jewish people got a Torah and entered the land of Israel and built a Mishkan and built a temple and so on. And in the end, yes, people are difficult and they don't do what you expect them to do, but in the end they do lots of mitzvot. And in the end, they influence their children. In the end, they influence other people. So, however frustrating it is, remember that if you look back at history, you can see that they're continuing this process. And sometimes they don't even know why they're involved, but that's the history that's behind them. That's the righteousness that lasts forever. When you do good, it's sort of like a DNA mutation. When you do good, you ingrain into the fundamental nature of your descendants an inclination to do good. Which is why, again, a lot of characteristics that you see in Jews, about in terms of generosity and decency and the sense of responsibility for beyond their own selves and family. I mean, it's interesting. It's not a criticism, but if you look, for example, at Oriental society, there's absolutely no sense that you're responsible for anyone else other than you and your own family. There simply is no sense, of global responsibility, which is, one of the problems that you get, in places like China and so on, because that means that for example, there's no sense as to why should I stop someone from dumping all kinds of poisons into the river that goes downstream, because absolutely no on one hand it's a groupthink society, but on the other hand there's no sense of responsibility to anyone other than oneself. There are many exceptions to the rule, but the point is that, and even in Western society, there's a very, it's mine, I can do what I want with it kind of thing. And whereas in Judaism, even after people no longer have any sense of what Judaism is, they have the sense of generosity, mutual responsibility, and so on and so forth.
Why then, if there's the idea that we want to help everyone, why then is there the idea that, like, when we're talking about profession, that for ourselves to be able to feed ourselves, but not to...
No, well, I think I think first of all, the Talmud says that there's poor and wealthy in every profession. If you're a merchant, you can work very hard. You might make a lot of money, you might not. One person can start a drugstore, and 50 years later they have a drugstore. One person start a drugstore, 50 years later they could have a chain of 500 drugstores. You know what I mean? That's to a certain extent up to God. But the premise is that a person works hard at whatever they're inclined to, and whatever God gives them, they share with others, and that's all good and fine. The point being that a person's focus, should be, on their Judaism, and from the working part, you'll get what God needs to give you and what you'll do with it. You know what I mean? Like I say, 10 people will work, one person, will be a plumber, the other will end up owning Roto-Rooter. That's to a certain extent not in your hands, or it's in the hands of what you're programmed to do well. But at the same time, the focus of a Jew is to study Torah and do mitzvot, and some of those mitzvot involve affecting the world. But the point is that someone might be this major philanthropist and you'll give billions of dollars to all kinds of important Jewish causes, and some person may be a guy who might be a tailor, who might study a Mishnah with one other person late at night when he finishes his work. But from God's perspective, in terms of the influence this tailor has, it might be greater than the great philanthropist. You simply don't know it. That's going back to Rebbe's point. You don't know. So the point is, a person should work honestly and leave time for their Jewish obligations, and one should not become consumed and identify oneself by one's work or career. And the rest in terms of affecting the world, we have a responsibility to the world, which means whether it's a nickel or $1 billion, you give what you have to give, and it's a matter of a collective thing. The sense of responsibility is separate from the sense of, because the premise of Judaism is that everyone is given exactly what they need to affect the world. And one person, a by-me-money person, might be something else entirely. So that you don't really control that. You control your inclinations. You don't control them. You're given inclinations. You're given gifts. You're given, people who become mechanics usually because they're inclined in that direction, and people who become stockbrokers because they're inclined in that direction. The question is, the moment you identify yourself, I'm a mechanic and that's my life, or I'm a stockbroker and that's my life, that's the moment where you've lost it. A separate question. How you affect the world? Well, you have responsibility. It might mean your next door neighbor. It might mean 1 million people. It depends what wherewithal God gives you. But no one has a scintilla of influence more or a penny more than God wants them to have. So the sense of responsibility is applied to whatever you're given. The only thing we really control ultimately in our lives, that we think we control more, is our choices, what we do with what we have, for good or evil. We don't control the situations we're put in. We don't control how much money we make. We think we do, but we don't.
Isn't what we do everything?
What?
Isn't what we do everything?
Not everything is a choice between right and wrong. Let's say you're an incredibly skilled musician by propensity. So it's likely you'll end up doing something with music. Now, whether you play Carnegie Hall and get $1 million record deals, or whether you play at Jewish weddings in Brooklyn, that comes from God. That you don't control. But what you do with both that talent and that ability and the money you make from it, that's your choice. That's it. But a lot of the other stuff, like I'm saying, we go through life making these choices and so on, but they're not truly free choices, because there's a lot we're programmed. But the choice whether to waste $1 or use it positively, the choice whether to waste my time or use it positively, the choice whether to use my charisma to swindle people or to convince them to do good things, those are real choices. And it's summed up in the statement in Tractate Nida, that ultimately everything about a person is defined by God, except whether you're righteous or wicked. That you don't define. That God doesn't define. That's up to you. Now, a twist is this whole idea that Torah without work is useless. So it's like the statement in the Torah, 6 days a week you shall work, is also in essence an obligation. So the point is that we need to go through the process of figuring out what we want to do career-wise. We need to go through the process of working and doing it diligently and appropriately. For a sculptor, it might spending obsessively 60 hours in a row on a sculpture. For an attorney, it might mean 90-hour weeks. But whatever is the appropriate due diligence for that person. But what comes out of that diligence, so that's a moral choice, whether to be honest, whether to carry your load, whether to make the effort to work, or just sit back and say, I'm someone special, you take care of me, or let society take care of me. Those are moral choices. But what comes out, whether you're a perpetually unemployed lawyer or someone who bills $2,500 an hour, that you don't control. And what you do with the money, whether it's $5 or $2,000 an hour, what you do with the money, that you do control, and that's a moral choice. So there's this interplay. So in other words, we have an obligation to act as if we control anything, but to recognize at the end of the day that we only control our moral choices. So you don't spend your life, you don't spend all your psychic energy frustrated over the things that in the end you couldn't control.
But isn't that why the melacha is so important in the context of Torah? Because there's so many opportunities there to challenge mitzvot. I mean, there's so many challenges that require the application of mitzvot in the melacha because of the interaction with the various peoples. And if one did just Torah and was in front of the book all day, all those opportunities would be there.
So, right. So,
and that's why the Torah would not really instantiate itself in the world.
Well, it's also true but Rabbi Gamliel is actually answering that question. Rabbi Gamliel,
nice word.
No, it's true. Rabbi Gamliel is answering that question. He says, "I consider as if you do it." There are going to be a few people whose job is to sit in front of the books and teach others. But if you teach people how to be honest, and they go out and they be honest, so it's as if you did it. So there always needs to be a small group of people who do this and who, in essence, are somewhat supported by the community, Yeah. But on the whole, in other words, that's the Lubavitch Rebbe actually spoke about this once. He says that's sort of like a necessary, not evil. In other words, the people who are the teachers and rabbis, they're not an elite. They're in essence like plumbers. They perform a necessary service. The ultimate goal of Judaism is, like you said, to go out in the world and by applying Torah mitzvot to the everyday life, changing it. You need a few people who are going to
organize it,
who are going to provide the information you need to do that. You're right. The IT department of any company, a bank, an auto company, and so on, doesn't exist for its own sake, though they sometimes think so. But the IT department exists, to provide the necessary information and so on, to the, and by the way, this propensity for IT departments to think they're ends in themselves is exactly what happens when you have situations where people imagine that studying of Torah is an end in it. So people imagine that they're devoting their whole lives to the study of Torah and nothing else is somehow a benefit. More than that, even the one who studies Torah has to go out and share it with someone.
Yeah.
In other words, and this mission is a great challenge, I think, to many people in the Jewish world today. Because if you think about it, what we're saying is, look, we all know that the basic obligation of the Jew is to study Torah. Studying Torah not just makes you a better person, it's an end in itself, because it's a union with God, it's becoming one with the mind of God. Judaism is unique, was a non-Jew, a Protestant minister, who was a significant scholar and professor in late 19th century England. He lived into the 20th century. His name was Travers Hereford, and he's the first person to really research from a non-Jewish perspective the rabbinical literature and give them credit. He wrote a translation of Pirkei Avot, which is very interesting. But in his introduction to his translation of Pirkei Avot, this non-Jew says, one of the things you have to understand about Judaism is that the act of study, which is seeking to understand the mind of God, is a religious end in itself. In other words, religious study is not for religion, it's an act of religious faith in itself. So learning Torah is terribly important because it's an act of unity with God and all that. But, again, without melacha, it ends up becoming a disaster. Because God didn't design the world that you should sit. Right? This week's Parshat Shlach, right? What did the spies want according to Chassidut? They wanted to live in the desert, eat manna, and study Torah all day. God says, no, you got to go to Israel and dig holes and plow the fields and all that. You got to work. So the problem becomes when you have people who say because the most important thing a Jew can do is studying Torah, which is true, therefore we should study Torah and organize our politics and our communities in such a way that we get paid to do it. And we're talking about people who are studying Torah as an end in itself, and they're not going out and teaching anyone. So we say, look, either work or make it possible, or be the people who work with the community. Either work or be the one who facilitates the people who work, that they should study Torah, they should have the answers to their questions, they should be educated, the children should be educated, so they can go out into the world. But otherwise, it ends up creating problems, as we see. So it's interesting how people who imagine you could create an entire society that's nothing but study Torah, and that other people should support it, can justify this in the context of this Mishnah. And there are many interpretations of this Mishnah, of course, which justify it, but None of them are particularly convincing to me. But at any rate, it's absolutely true, and that's why. It goes deeper than that. The Lubavitcher Rebbe once made the point. He says, "Why is it that we're in exile, and the nature of our exile is such that as the years go by, we become more and more dependent on interaction with non-Jews to make a living? Right? We live in an integrated economy. We don't live in an isolated economy anymore, right? So everything we do involves the whole world." He says that's exactly the point, because when the Jew goes out into the world and demonstrates their loyalty to God comes before everything else, comes Shabbat, you put the tools down, but more than that, you're honest, and you share because you interact with so many people all over the world, you share with them those things in Judaism that are universal, e.g. the obligation to train people about the Noahide laws. So the point is, the reason why to make a living we interact with everyone, not just the Jewish community, but beyond it, is precisely because we have a responsibility to get those ideas across. And yes, you're right. If you locked yourself in a closet with a Gemara, it would be a wonderful thing, for learning Torah, but you wouldn't have the capacity to influence others or do all the mitzvot that relate to interaction with other human beings. So this is really a crucial point about how the Jewish community should be set up. Now, Rabban Gamliel goes on to say, and he lives already. So after the Bar Kokhba revolt, after Rabbi Yehuda Nasi sort of settled with the Romans, so by now we're sort of deep into the 4th century. This is before the Roman Empire becomes Christian, but after the big conflicts are all over. So it's possible to have some interaction with the ruling authorities, but he warns you, Havizahirin b'Rashus, be very careful with Rashut literally means domain. Right? A private domain is where you alone have the power to do your thing. Rashut basically means a space of power. So be careful with those who hold power. She'ein mekarven lo la'adam, and this is true from that day to this day. They only draw someone close, el tzarach atzman, for their own case. In other words, no politician ever seeks to benefit someone except to the extent that it helps their particular goals. And the other point is, Rashut means power. The greater the power of an individual, the more their concern is only with themselves. In other words, if you dilute the power and people are representing other people, so if they're genuinely representing them, but Rashut means the power they hold. And obviously the more a person holds power and the less they're connected, the less they're responsible to the people who hold the power over, such as a monarchy or really any modern system where there's, where representation is nominal. There's so many layers in between, so be careful. They appear like your best friend when they benefit from your help. But at the times of your difficulty, they don't stand up for you because they're there for themselves, not for you. So if the time of your difficulty is timed with their need for money or their need for an election, so you're in luck. But if the time of your difficulty is timed where they don't need you, it's in between elections, the monarchy has enough money, so then you're out of luck. And the point is, so he's basically saying that I am. If you notice, the first Mishnah basically tells us to work with people for altruistic means. He says, however, don't assume that that's the way the world is. It's something that we expect from the Jewish community and hope maybe other people learn, but on the whole, it's not the way the world works. And so he's actually saying something really important, which is don't assume other people think like you. It's really important to know who you're dealing with. And understand that if people are coming from a different background and looking at things a different way, in other words, there's a certain naivete sometimes where you assume everyone is as nice and good as you are. And it's not necessarily the case. And not that you're intrinsically nice and good, but you made the effort at it. But if you have a system, for example, where the most violent and most powerful rise to the top. So you're going to get a different kind of person. In other words, basically, in the Jewish community, at least historically, certainly after the end of the political rule, the people who rise to the top are the people who are most sympathetic, or most empathetic, or most responsible, or most devoted to others rather than to themselves. Your typical rabbinic leader. But out there, in the realm of political power, the most violent, the most selfish, and the most willing to behave in a Machiavellian manner is the one who gets power. So don't make the assumption they're going to be like you, and work with your values. In other words, it's okay to be nice to everyone, but it's not okay to assume that just because you value something, someone else does. And from where would they have such a value? That's one point. That's the simplest. There's a deeper point here, though, which is that there's a temptation to sort of identify yourself, by political power. In other words, to sort of buy into the system and saying, the system is good for me, it helps me, and therefore I should make sacrifices and compromises in my Judaism to be part of the system. But the answer is the system is not there for you. The system is there for whoever holds the power. And the flip side is it's the other way too. Reshut again means domain. It means exclusive power. I think there's another point he's making. Be careful with Reshut. What he's saying is that if you have a say in it, the next step is again, because we're talking about teaching them, if you have a say in the matter, don't let Reshut exist. But if you have a say in the matter, the more you give power to an individual, and the more there's no checks and balances on that power, the more they're going to be for themselves and only use people. So have a here and be careful. And by the way, some commentaries say about the Jewish community, don't make dictators in the Jewish community. Don't give anyone absolute power. You give people absolute power, you're in for a lot of trouble. We see in this throughout Jewish history. Don't imitate the world out there and give people absolute power. And on the broader sense of all, Havizahirim Reshut, be careful with Reshut, which means Reshut means again complete power. A private domain means I can do what I want in that domain, right? A person's Reshut extends on Shabbat 6 feet in a public place, because 6 feet is as far as you can stretch out your arms and manipulate things. Be careful with Reshut. Don't go around giving it out like candy. Don't go around giving out absolute power. Why? Because the moment you give something absolute power, you've created a monster. And I think that's the deepest sense. The deepest sense is be careful. By the way, because it doesn't say be careful with leaders. It could have said be careful with kings, be careful with rulers. Reshut is not a political end. It doesn't say be careful with leaders, with rulers, with kings, with governors, with politicians. Reshut simply means power. Be careful with power, because when you create power, you create a monster that only benefits people when it's for them, and couldn't care less about them when it isn't. So, if you have a say in the matter, make sure no one has absolute power. Make sure that people are answerable. Because if it's about them, you're going to be selfish. If it's about others, even if you're a limited person, since the others have a say, you're going to have to behave yourself. So that I think is an observation, both for the Jewish community and beyond it, that power that is centered in one person and isn't conditional is very, very dangerous. And again, you see in this in Jewish communities too, where throughout history, because of perhaps closeness to a monarch, because of other factors, perhaps wealth being concentrated in a few hands, you had people who basically had authority without any responsibility, and it was never a good thing. Hu HaYomer, one more. He used to say, "Aseh Ritzono K'Ritzoncha." Actually, this is a very big and complicated deal. So we'll look at it next week. So I should just point out there's one more statement here, Now, so there's one big question. Let's actually dwell on this. This statement is a very good statement about the practicalities of dealing with politics. But why is it in Pirkei Avot? This is a sensible idea that belongs in the Jewish leader's manual. But Pirkei Avot is a universal book designed to teach us how to serve God and how to be better Jews. What exactly is the spiritual message here? We understand the practical and political message, but that's not the purpose of Pirkei Avot. Pirkei Avot ultimately is about, we said before at the very beginning, in the first week, that it's about the kind of person you want to be.
So is it to avoid any potential for taking power on any aspect? So sort of try to divest yourself from positions of power. It doesn't matter where they are, not necessarily political.
Well, so he makes the interesting point that actually it doesn't say don't engage power. It says Babi Zahirim, be careful with it. I don't tell some, right? We said earlier, be careful with the sages. Learn from them, but don't be obnoxious to them, because they carry spiritual power with them. When we don't tell someone, be careful when you hit your brother over the head with a hammer, because we don't want our children to hit their siblings over the head with hammers. Just don't do it, okay? Like, don't be careful when you run out into the street. Don't run out into the street, right? And don't be careful about the kind of mess you leave in your room. Don't leave a mess in your room, right? So, but what do we tell children? We say, if we let them help out with the barbecue, be careful with the fire. When they learn to drive, be careful with the car. Don't take them fishing. Don't don't get the hook. Be careful with the hook. You don't want to get the hook stuck in your lip or something, right? So we tell people to be careful with things because they're useful things and good things, but you have to be careful. So be careful with power. Don't allow, and this is the spiritual point. You have to engage the world. You have to engage politics. You have to be involved in it. You have to create political structures of your own community. Be careful with it. And this is not simply advice. This is spiritual advice, because it's saying that you have to be the kind of person who is careful, who looks at the spiritual implications. In other words, it's not, okay, I finished being Jewish, now I'm dealing with politics. No, you have to look at what the spiritual implications are. Be careful that you not allow it to corrupt or degrade your Judaism. Sometimes we have a propensity, we want to make political points, so we distort Judaism. We make Judaism say what we want the powers that be to hear. Which had this curiosity, that at a given moment in history, you could have people, and you have the government rabbis in Tsarist Russia declaring that Judaism supports absolute monarchy, and you have rabbis in New York saying that Judaism believes in representative democracy, and there
was
and you have the
fellow for the Soviet government in Moscow Choral Synagogue.
I know there's a tefillah for the Tsar, that one for the Soviet government also. How do you pray for a government that doesn't? How do you pray for a government that doesn't believe in God? In other words, you can pray for the Tsar and ask God to watch over him. One assumes the Tsar wants God to watch over him. How do you pray for God to to watch over someone who doesn't want to be watched over by God? This, of course, are the great internal paradoxes.
Give him the right reward. That's what you pray for.
Right? Yeah. Well, that's the line, right? Like the God should preserve and keep the Tsar far away from us, right? But on a deeper level, the point is that you don't allow be careful. Don't allow it to distort your Judaism, because there's always and that's an internal spiritual message, because more than that. If you have this situation where every time there's an issue, you have people who believe that the important thing is to be loved by society. So you have like this. You have this paradox where where in 1880 in 1840 the Reformed rabbis in Cincinnati declared that slavery is a mitzvah and it's a good thing, and that those who seek to abolish it are rebels against God. Yeah. And that was the center of the Reform movement. And in 1960, seeing the way the wind was blowing, they declared civil rights as an important thing. In the Reform movement in England declared, because divorce was considered sinful, even in Protestant circles, that Judaism makes divorce too easy, and now they yell it makes divorce too hard. In the 19th century they declared that industrial progress should trump everything, including Shabbat and anything else, and now all of a sudden they discovered the environment. And the point is that if you belong to if your thought process as a Jew is focused around ingratiating yourself with whatever the mass belief is, so you will always find something in Judaism to support it, even though in the end it may not at all be supported by Judaism. You make Judaism subjective, and that's the danger. Be careful with Reshut. Don't be in the position of being forced to, or thinking you're forced to tell people what they want to hear, because you want a share of that power, or you want to be on good terms with that power. You see. I mean, what fundamentally changed? In the 50s, when Israel was a much more popular project in the academic world, all the Jewish professors were pro-Israel. Now you have an enormous number of Jewish academics who are the biggest detractors and opposers of Israel. Well, what changed? What changed is the way the wind was blowing. The Reshut, the world they live in. The Reshut is the political world you live in. So be careful with it, because in the end, it's completely utilitarian. There's no deep spiritual truth in their accepting you. Their acceptance of you is political, because that's the nature. So don't compromise your spiritual values for temporary political gain, because you discover that it's not a gain at all. And then it's not just politics; it's society. Yes, there are many things in Judaism that might not be popular today, but again, they weren't popular a long time ago. People used to complain that Jews gave charity. If you're not meant to have money, you should die out. People complain that the Jews didn't kill their disabled children, because who wants to leave defectives in the world? In ancient times, people complain that Jews keep Shabbat, they're lazy. They complain they work too hard and make too much money, and it's not fair, right? So there's always something to complain about Jews. Henry Ford complained the Jews were communists, and Lenin complained they were capitalists, right? So in the end, you have to be loyal to yourself, because there's no inherent truth in power, because power is purely about an individual or group self-aggrandizement. So that therefore one should see no spiritual value in it, and therefore there's no point in sacrificing to it. And that's the great lesson that Rabbi Gamliel is telling us. That no matter how tempting it seems, no matter how much the benefit may be, it's never worth making the slightest spiritual sacrifice on what you believe or how you do mitzvot for even seemingly the greatest gain. Don't ever change anything because of a perceived political benefit, because it isn't there. And that would have saved us a lot of trouble. I mean, you see this. You see this with contemporary Israel, right? So the world says you're occupying Palestinian territories, so we'll leave Gaza. No. People start complaining any less. Now somehow it's still all your fault what goes on in Gaza. You know? Israel invades Lebanon and then moves out of Beirut. And the Christians kill the Muslims because the Muslims have been killing the Christians because the Christians have been killing the Muslims for the last 1,000 years, 1,200 years. All of a sudden, somehow it's Israel's fault. So you can't win. Because there's no fundamental interest in truth in the corridors of power. So therefore, you're best off doing what's right, doing what the Torah tells you to do, and let the people kvetch, because they'll kvetch anyways. It's the most amazing thing. There is this. It's on YouTube. There's Abba Eban being interviewed by whoever was the first big American newscaster in the 1950s. I forget his name. Well-known name. What? Before Cronkite. No, but the guy who was before Cronkite. This was in the 50s. So, yes, now we have this conversation, Israel shouldn't be in the post-67 borders, regardless of the pre-67 borders. So this is 1955. Mr. Eban, why are the Israelis occupying the post-1947 borders? The United Nations gave you these places, and then you this little impossible state. Why are you still occupying the territory that you conquered in the War of Independence? As well, Historia. No, So you see, so if you give back to the 67, well, why don't you go back to the 47 borders? The 47 borders want to know, why don't you accept what you were promised in the Peel Commission in 1937? And the point is why? Because it's not about some ultimate truth that you can get to. It's about power. It's about the influence of oil money. And that's that. So Rabbi Gamliel is making a very important point, that spiritual capital, that moral capital, that ethical capital is never worth spending on the political, because one is true and the other is inherently and intrinsically false. You're paying good money for something worthless. Thank you very much. Have a good Shabbos.
Rabbi, a garden around a home, single-family home.
Yeah.
That's a Carmelite, correct?
Unless you put a wall around it. Unless you have
then
a
it
fence.
would be a private domain.
Yeah.
If it's high enough.
Yeah.
But if it's not high enough...
It's 2.5 feet. It's no big deal.
Oh, it's 2.5 feet?
Yeah.
But what if it's...
It's like 36, 37 inches.
I'm asking...
3 feet is certainly good. And you can also make a tzurah pesach. You can also put up poles with strings.
Oh.
You can make like the Eruv, the same thing. You can make poles with strings across them.
Say if you want to go out and move things to the garden, okay?
Yeah.
Then
you just put like 6 poles all around, and you put strings across the tops of them.
which you would need for the driveway, because presumably, so what do you do with the driveway that has the garden on both sides?
Well, if you have these poles all around,
around the garden.
Right, and the driveway is less than 15 feet wide.
Okay.
Then that's fine.
Oh, okay.
If the driveway is framed on both sides,
Yeah.
if it's more than 15 feet, you just put a pole on each side of the driveway and a string over it high enough that the car doesn't interfere with it.
Oh, I see. Interesting. So in fact...
And they don't have to be heavy poles, because they just have to support a string. I use fishing line because it's strongest and sags the least. Mm-hmm. Now my landlord put up a fence all around the backyard, but But a garden is only a carmelite if it's not surrounded by a wall. Now, if it was wild space, then it would be a carmelite even with a wall. But if it's used for the people of the house, if people use it, so then it's not a carmelite, even if it's very big. a park that's used by people and surrounded by a fence is a Reshut HaYachid, not a Kohen.
Now, with regards to fences, so a fence which is made out of, say, poles like that is a proper wall, correct?
Right. If it's otherwise, if you have like a rail
Chain
fence,
link or something.
So chain link is simple. As long the chain link is considered a solid wall, as long as it's less than 3 inches. If each link is smaller than 3 inches, which of course it is. Chain link fence is perfect; it's no problem.
Okay.
But even a rail fence, as long as there's no more than 9 inches. So if you have, for example, a low fence, not with the doorways, just like a rail fence, a 3-rail fence. So if it's at least 3 feet tall, you need like 4. Basically, there can't be more than 9 inches of space between each rail. So if you have 3 rails, then the ground, so that's 36 inches, right? So you have 1 rail and 9 inches, 1 rail, 9 inches. So as long as the whole thing is 36 inches from top to bottom, and there's no more than 9 inches of empty space between each rail, you're fine.
Yeah.
So if the rails are fat,
That's for the deck, for example.
yeah, right, yeah, the boards. But again,
Yeah.
that's fine. Again, but it has to be more than 36 inches.
From the
Top to
front.
bottom, and if you're using straight rails, there can't be more than 9 inches between each rail.
And what do you do if you've got one side that has an opening with steps that go into the garden? So
Again, as long as it's surrounded by a
no,
kosher,
it's 1, 2, and then a little bit.
and the other side is the house.
And the outside is the house.
Right.
Oh,
So
yeah.
as long as the space, as if a majority of the thing is surrounded, as long as the majority is surrounded with a kosher fence, as long as the open piece is not more than 15 feet wide, you're fine.
Very good.
Yes, it's not a problem at all. It's not an issue at all. It's fine.
Thank you.
So there are a lot of ways to skin that particular cat. If you want, you can snap a picture of what you're planning on doing or done and send it to me.